Only 14 people witnessed it, not 14,000 watching ringside, not millions on film. 14. And in that moment, in those 3 seconds, a world champion learned the difference between confidence and delusion. He learned it the hard way. He learned it in pain. The footage was never released. No photographs survive. The witnesses were sworn to silence by handlers desperate to protect a reputation that was already unraveling. But the story never died. It lived in locker rooms, in martial arts circles, whispered between fighters who understood what speed actually meant. It became legend before it ever became history. So rewind. Let's go back to the moment everything changed. The venue was a converted warehouse in the industrial quarter, exposed brick, brutal lighting, the kind of place where the air smelled like tape and ambition. The Netherlands Kickboxing Championship had drawn the continent's elite, Dutch fighters with a hunger for dominance, Belgian technicians, a few Thais who'd crossed the sea to prove their system against European legs and European power. But the real draw wasn't the tournament. It was Udo Heberlein, a German champion who'd spent 3 years running through every heavyweight in Europe. 6'3", 230 pounds of muscle, trained in a particular school of thought, that size, strength, and explosive power were the only language worth speaking. He'd knocked out 7 consecutive opponents. 7. His nickname, Der Berg, the mountain, wasn't ironic. Heberlein wore his credentials like a crown. He moved through the venue with the bearing of someone who'd never tasted defeat, never felt real pressure, never met an opponent who didn't flinch when he entered the room. His handlers orbited him, a manager in an expensive suit, a trainer with Eastern European vowels, a doctor who looks more like security. He was untouchable, inevitable. He was also, on this particular evening, supremely bored. The tournament had been running for 6 hours. The matches were clean but predictable. He'd come to be challenged, to add another name to his list, to remind Europe why heavyweight kickboxing belonged to him. Instead, he was watching semifinals that would take another 3 hours before he even stepped onto the mat. So he decided to entertain himself. During the intermission before the final bracket, Heberlein walked to the center of the ring. The crowd sensed it immediately. This was not scheduled. The referee looked confused. The promoter stood up. Heberlein grabbed the microphone. "I want to volunteer," he announced, his German accent cracking the warehouse acoustics. "Not from the tournament, from anywhere. Give me a real fight, someone willing to test themselves against an actual champion." He was smiling, the smile of a man who'd never been surprised. "Who's brave enough?" The crowd erupted, exactly as he'd anticipated. This was vintage Heberlein, a showman playing to the moment, a fighter so confident he could afford to take unscheduled challenges. It was arrogance dressed as generosity. Hands shot up, young Dutch fighters wanting a story, a moment, a claim to efface Der Berg. The manager was gesturing for Heberlein to decline, to stay focused, to not risk injury, but Heberlein was already pointing to a heavyweight from Rotterdam, someone massive, tattooed, clearly strong. They were clearing space. A second mat was being prepared. The crowd was electric. But then something changed. A figure stood from the audience. He was moving slowly, deliberately, from the back bleachers toward the apron, not rushing, not eager, not trying to impress anyone. He was tall, lean, muscular in a way that suggested function rather than display. He wore dark clothes. His face was calm, completely calm. He was also only wearing training shoes and regular clothes. No gi, no hand wraps, no corner team rushing behind him. Heberlein's smile faltered for half a second. "And who are you?" Heberlein asked. The crowd had gone quiet. Something in this man's presence had shifted the room. "Chuck Norris," the man said, his voice quiet. "American. No fanfare, no introduction necessary, at least not to anyone who paid attention to martial arts." The warehouse noise dropped further. Heberlein's manager was suddenly moving toward the ring. Other handlers appeared. There were urgent conversations happening in German and Dutch. The referee looked to the promoter. The promoter looked panicked. Because what had started as a confident champion looking for an easy moment had just become something no one had scheduled. Chuck Norris, at 34, was semi-retired from professional karate. He'd already won national championships, already trained sororities, already proven himself. He wasn't hungry in the way Heberlein was hungry. He wasn't trying to build a legacy. His was already built. But he was also not a man who backed down. Heberlein recovered quickly. His smile returned, bigger now, because even with the name, even with the reputation, Heberlein was convinced this was still a favorable proposition. Norris was older. Norris wasn't in tournament condition. Norris was wearing street clothes. Heberlein was a heavyweight kickboxing specialist on his own mat with his corner crew and his momentum. "Okay," he said, "but we need rules. We need wraps." The handlers were still panicking, but Norris simply shrugged. There was something about his willingness that made Heberlein's confidence even stronger, like he'd just been given permission to destroy something.
They wrapped hands. Someone provided headgear. Norris moved through the preparations with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times, not with the ritual of someone preparing for war, just routine, muscle memory. Heberlein was moving now, rotating his shoulders, throwing combinations into the air, showing his speed, his weight, his readiness. He was a German tank with precision steering, and he wanted Norris to understand the magnitude of the mistake he just made. The crowd pressed closer. Only 14 people would later admit they'd seen what was about to happen. 14. The warehouse had maybe 200 bodies, but only 14 were positioned right, paying attention right, their cognitive processing fast enough to actually comprehend the sequence. The other 186 would spend the next 5 years arguing about what they'd actually witnessed. Chuck Norris stepped into the ring. He wasn't in a traditional stance. His hands were lower than Haberlin's. His posture was upright. He looked almost casual. It was a radical difference from Haberlin's forward aggressive position, his chin tucked, his power coiled. The referee looked at both fighters. "You ready?" Haberlin nodded immediately, still confident, still moving. Norris inclined his head slightly. The ref raised his hand. The room held its breath. Actually held it. 60-second pause. 186 people and 14 conscious witnesses, and one man about to learn something that would change his understanding of human capability. The whistle blew. Haberlin came forward immediately. Not recklessly. He was a trained fighter, controlled, technical. He threw a jab to test distance, fast, professional. It was a checking punch, a greeting, a way of establishing that his hand speed was already superior. Norris didn't block it, didn't move, just let the punch come to him. At the exact moment Haberlin's fist was 6 inches from contact, a timing window that required either genius or supernatural processing speed, Norris moved. Not backward, lateral. His whole body shifted 90 degrees to the right. The jab passed through empty space where his face had been a millisecond prior. Haberlin's momentum carried him forward. 1 second elapsed. Before Haberlin could recover, Norris's body pivot had already transferred his weight into a counter. His right leg came up in a perfect vertical line. Not a kick in the sense of a movement that started at the hip and swept through space. This was a knee strike, compact, inescapable, physics assisted by Norris's pivot and Haberlin's own momentum. The impact point was Haberlin's lips on the left side. Clean contact. The sound was different from normal impact sounds. It was dull. It was the sound of air leaving lungs. It was the sound of a man's body recognizing trauma. 2 seconds elapsed. Haberlin staggered backward. His arms dropped. His breathing had stopped. Not because he was choosing to hold it, because his diaphragm had been shocked into silence. He was still standing, but his center of gravity was collapsing. His eyes were wide. Shock. Genuine shock. Not hurt. He hadn't processed the pain yet. Just the impossibility of what had occurred. Norris didn't follow up. He stepped back, lowered his hands. His expression hadn't changed. No celebration, no triumph, just a return to stillness. The referee was already moving, checking on Haberlin, looking for whether he could continue. 3 seconds elapsed. Haberlin was done. His body knew it before his mind did. He held up a hand. He was breathing now, pulling air in broken gasps, his left side clearly screaming. The referee was calling it. Match over.
The warehouse didn't erupt. That's what made it real. In normal fights, in tournaments, in sanctioned matches, in moments of legitimate triumph, the crowd loses its mind. Sound erupts. It's a release of collective tension. But this wasn't collective. The 186 people who hadn't actually seen it were still trying to understand what had happened. They'd seen Haberlin go down, but the mechanism was invisible to them. The 14 who'd seen it didn't cheer. They stared. They were trying to reverse engineer what their eyes had processed. They were trying to understand the speed differential. They were trying to comprehend how a man in street clothes and hand wraps had just demolished a heavyweight champion in 3 seconds using a single technique. Haberlin was still struggling to breathe. His corner team rushed into the ring. His manager was checking his ribs, looking for breaks. His trainer was asking questions in urgent German. Haberlin couldn't answer. He couldn't do anything except stay bent over and pull oxygen. Chuck Norris was already out of the ring. He walked back to where he'd come from, moving through the crowd with the same unhurried pace he'd used to approach the mat. No one stopped him. No one called him back. No one demanded an explanation or a victory lap. He simply left. The tournament resumed 15 minutes later. The promoter had to calm the energy, had to reset the mental state of everyone present. Some of them had questions. Most of them had doubts about what they'd witnessed. Haberlin competed in his scheduled championship match 2 hours later. He won, but something had changed in his fighting style. His signature aggression was muted. His confidence had been replaced with caution. He'd learned something in 3 seconds that would take most fighters a whole career to understand.
Within 48 hours, the story had traveled through the European martial arts underground. Not the official story. The official story would be local Dutch champion challenges foreign visitor. Dutch fighter wins. The tournament organizers had their narrative ready, and Haberline's management wasn't going to contradict it publicly. But the real story, the true story, moved through locker rooms and training halls and late-night conversations between fighters who understood what impossible speed looked like. Fighters who'd trained with Chuck Norris were suddenly seeing him differently. The speed they'd always attributed to his karate style, all those point-fighting championships, all those tournament wins, took on a new dimension. This wasn't speed as a trait. This was speed as mastery. Speed as something that transcended the normal rules of human movement. Word reached America. American fighters who'd competed against Norris, who'd felt his kicks firsthand in tournaments, suddenly understood why they'd always felt like they were fighting at half speed. Not because Norris was impossibly fast, but because they'd been operating at normal speed while he occupied a different temporal plane. The story changed martial arts perception in subtle ways. It became a proof point in the growing movement away from pure size and strength. It was evidence that speed and efficiency could overcome raw power. It was a philosophical statement wrapped in 3 seconds of physical action. Haberline continued fighting for another 4 years. He never again challenged an opponent outside his established control. He never again offered open invitations to volunteers. He became technically proficient, strategically cautious, and mentally aware that there were levels to this sport he'd never reach. Chuck Norris never mentioned it. When asked about that night in Amsterdam, and he would be asked dozens of times, he'd give a brief answer, acknowledge the opponent's skill, and move on. He had no interest in narrative control, no need to sell a story that was already legendary without his help. That's what separates actual masters from people who simply look the part.
The real significance of what happened in those 3 seconds wasn't about dominance. It wasn't about proving that Chuck Norris was stronger or tougher or more dedicated than Udo Haberlin. Haberlin was a legitimate heavyweight champion with credentials that can't be disputed. He was powerful, he was fast by normal standards, he was trained. What happened was a demonstration of something far more profound. Haberlin came into that ring believing that his mass, his strength, his tournament wins, and his reputation were the highest expression of martial capability. They were his advantages. He was using them as he'd been trained to use them, aggressively, decisively, with power. Chuck Norris came into that ring with a different philosophy. Not force against force, not testing who could generate more power. Instead, perfect positioning, perfect timing, perfect understanding of how force actually works. He didn't match Haberlin's power because he didn't have to. He took Haberlin's own momentum, his own mass, his own forward intention, and converted it into his defeat. This is what mastery actually looks like. Not the announcement of it, not the trophy or the title or the narrative control, but the quiet understanding of principles so deep that they appear invisible to anyone who hasn't studied them. Speed appears impossible until you realize it's mostly about removing unnecessary movement. Power appears superhuman until you understand it's mostly about efficiency. Dominance appears like magic until you recognize it's mostly about patience and timing, and a willingness to let your opponent defeat himself. Haberlin wanted to be the strongest man in the room. Chuck Norris just wanted to understand force. And in a 3-second window where those philosophies collided, understanding won. The story of Amsterdam never made the official record. No fight commission documented it, no sanctioning body certified it, the witnesses signed no affidavits. The video was never archived. The photograph was never published. By every measure of official martial arts history, it didn't happen. And yet it became more real than any official match ever could be. Because that's how legends work. They survive outside the system. They exist in the gaps between official narrative and actual truth. They travel through the oral traditions of people who were there, people who matter, people who have the knowledge to understand what they witnessed. 20 years after that night,
fighters would still reference it. Not the name, most didn't remember the exact name of the opponent, but the principle. You ever hear about the time in Amsterdam? Did you know about the 3 seconds thing? There's this story about Chuck Norris that nobody talks about, but everyone knows. It became a touchstone, a proof that speed and efficiency were superior to mass and strength, a reminder that confidence without understanding was just arrogance wearing expensive clothes. Udo Haberlein retired from fighting in 1978. He lived a quiet life in Berlin. He never spoke publicly about Amsterdam. When journalists would ask, he'd deflect or claim not to remember. But the people close to him said he was different after that night, more humble, less certain that size was destiny. Chuck Norris moved on to television, to movies, to a completely different form of fame that had nothing to do with martial arts anymore. But among fighters, among people who understood what was actually happening in those 3 seconds, his legend only grew. Because the story did what only the greatest stories do. It simplified a complex truth into something unforgettable. It showed that mastery isn't about being the biggest or the strongest. It's about understanding principles so completely that you can dismantle anything built on inferior understanding. It proved that philosophy matters more than muscles, that efficiency beats effort, that true power isn't measured in pounds of force, but in knowledge converted into action.
Only 14 people witnessed it. Only 14 can truly say they saw those 3 seconds unfold. But the legend of Amsterdam lives on. It's been transmitted through generations of martial artists. It's been referenced in training halls from Tokyo to New York. It's been used as a teaching tool to explain why speed matters, why timing matters, why philosophy matters more than physiology. And the beauty of the story is that it doesn't need the footage. It doesn't need the official documentation or the sanctioning body approval or the judges' scorecards. It's become more powerful precisely because it exists outside the official system. It's a story about how a champion learned the difference between confidence and competence. It's about what happens when force meets understanding. And understanding, every single time, wins. The moment lasted 3 seconds. The legend has lasted 50 years. And it will continue to last, passed from fighter to fighter, from student to master, as long as people are interested in what true mastery actually looks like. That's the story of Amsterdam. That's the story of what happened when a world champion asked for a volunteer and got something he wasn't prepared to understand.